all of our programming at Campus Life. She is the faculty advisor for LEAD, and LEAD will facilitate the second half of this program. I would also like to acknowledge our Vice President for Student Affairs, Dr. Jermaine Wright, who connected us to Dr. Wilson, and our very dedicated staff members at Campus Life, David Chacape, Nathaniel Gaskew, Emily Weiland, and thank them for all the work they do and their love for our students. Dr. Wright will now introduce Dr. Wilson.
Great, good afternoon, everyone, or should I say good evening. The time has been going away from me. It's been one of those days. Before I go ahead and introduce Dr. Wilson, I do want to somewhat set the context of welcome everyone to our kickoff for our leadership nights. I don't know if when Suzette selected me, it was either because I was the VP or this was just some of my areas of interest. For those who are not familiar with me as yet, as I know, we've been in this virtual state of being and we're now coming back to 70% in person, and hopefully as we move into the fall, I'll begin to see more and more of our students and faculty and staff on the campus. But I also taught leadership and diversity at Rutgers University at the master's level. After I had completed my doctorate degree, I wanted to not only be a part of the administration, as I've been now a part of higher education administration for the last 16 plus years, but also wanted to understand the plight of my colleagues within the teaching arena, but then also wanted to hear from students from a classroom context. So I maintained a small teaching load of a class here and there, and hopefully would do the same at Lehman as I balance things out a bit, in particular the political science department, as my degree is amplifying access, social justice, and equity for all. This context of leadership versus management, the different theories and concepts of, is leadership innate, can it be taught? Is it a higher level of management? What are some of the similarities between the two? But whatever the leadership dynamics and styles and theories and practices that we conform to, the important piece of the crossroads in which we are speaking to specifically is that access and social justice piece. That was the real impetus for the class that I taught, and thinking about how we're exemplifying that in our week that we have here with some dynamic speakers who will be here before you. So I wanted to highlight that and say thank you for this opportunity, Suzette, for me to actually, I went back and looked at some of my slides from the class and smiled in just great revelry in how much that class in 2014, when I taught it 8 years ago, meant to me, and this opportunity of what we will share with our students during this week and what it will do for them as well. As I wear my glasses because I just can't see, but it's also a lens, right? It's a lens to amplify my vision, and the lens in which we put on the social justice lens in our leadership capacities and role will help us to amplify our vision, will help us to ensure access and to be a more equitable institution in the way that we lead and inclusive of all. So I'm going to get off my soapbox, and then I'm going to read the bio for our speaker this evening, our first speaker this evening to kick us off. So Dr. Tajuan R. Wilson is a 15-year education administrator, faculty member, and a 2004 Bearden High School graduate. Dr. Wilson earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science and Communications in 2007. A Master's of Public Administration with an emphasis on government management in 2009, and a Doctor of Education with an emphasis in higher education administration in 2015. Additionally, he has completed postgraduate work at Stanford University, Harvard University, Cornell University, Yale University, and Vanderbilt Law School. As a first-generation college graduate and federal TRIOS programs alum, he has devoted his career empowering historically underrepresented populations. Dr. Wilson serves as the managing associate for the Diversified Search Group, specifically Storbeck Search, where he is directing client engagement across all phases of the search process, and serves as in a consultative role to clients regarding strategic hiring decisions and organizational development. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our Leadership Night's first kickoff speaker, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to share my screen and then we will jump right in. Can everybody see that okay? Fantastic, fantastic. So I'm excited to be here. This presentation is structured in such a way that I hope that you feel comfortable jumping in at any point in time. It's a little difficult sometimes to monitor the chat as you are presenting with this particular view. And so if at any point in time something pops up in the chat, anybody who is in leadership on this call, feel free to jump in and stop me. But I want this to be somewhat interactive. There are going to be a couple of activities where I will ask you to engage via chat. And it's a small enough group that we may even be able to unmute and just jump in and share a bit with one another as well, right? And so this evening's topic is really around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's going to center around how do you develop an inclusive culture while being intentional in doing so. And so that's our conversation tonight. I have a tendency of being somewhat of a talker, and so I've given everybody permission to stop me at a certain point if I run over here this evening. We're going to jump straight in. So this evening, we don't have a whole lot of time together, but the time that we have, we're going to make the most of it. And so I'm going to speak briefly about myself. That was a wonderful introduction that Dr. Wright gave. And so we'll be able to skip through quite a bit of that, but I do think it's important to frame just who I am as a professional and as an individual. We're going to go through a very quick exercise where we identify your why, your own personal connection to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. We're going to go very quickly through terminology because sometimes I find that people misunderstand definitions when we talk about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion and inclusive excellence. Then we're going to talk about why all of this matters, right? Why diversity, equity, and inclusion are important. We're going to give you practical steps on how to build your own toolkit around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to ask you to engage in some personal reflection, and then we will wrap up this evening with a quick call to action. Hopefully that sounds okay with everyone. So I won't spend a lot of time in this particular space because it's mostly been mentioned, but I grew up in South Arkansas in a really small town, Bearden, Arkansas, where the population is only about 800 folks. And high school was the finish line. If you graduated high school, you were considered to be a success, right? You could go off and you could get a general labor position at the local paper mill. And that's what most of the people in my hometown did. I'm a very proud first generation college graduate, and I credit my parents for really pushing me. I credit federal TRIO programs like Educational Talent Search and Upward Bound, Student Support Services, and McNair with that success as well. My career has taken me lots of places. And so again, grew up in Arkansas. I lived in Oklahoma for a while where I started my career in higher education. I would then go back to Arkansas very briefly and then move to Wyoming. I worked at the University of Wyoming for a bit. I then spent 6 years at Missouri and then eventually went on to South Carolina and then on to Iowa, where I served as Chief Diversity Officer there. And most recently at Georgia Southern University, where I served as Chief Diversity Officer as well. As was mentioned, I've been in the field for about 15 years. My family is absolutely everything to me. And community is absolutely everything to me. I have a scholarship foundation that I started about 6 years ago, specifically to assist students who are first generation, students who are low income, and to provide access to them in that space as well. Won't spend a whole lot of time here, but this is just an overview of my career journey because people often ask, like, how did you get started? What were each of the steps in your career to get to where you are now? And a lot of times here recently, people are asking, why did you make the decision to step away from university life as a Chief Diversity Officer? And my answer to that is very simple. I saw it as a very unique opportunity to continue having a larger impact by making sure that we think strategically about how we recruit, source, and place executives across the country as it relates to higher education institutions. And so in my role now, I specifically recruit and source out and place folks in positions like university presidents, vice presidents across the spectrum. We also do some work in K-12 heads of schools, and we also do some work with corporate and healthcare and IT, and do a few corporate board placements as well. So there's a very unique opportunity in that space to continue the work of DEI to make sure that we are diversifying those spaces as well. And so excited about that. So our first quick activity this evening is I want to help you identify your why diversity, equity, and inclusion may be important to you. There are lots of ways to do this, but this is a very simple and quick exercise that I would like to run you through. So there's been a time in everyone's life where you have personally felt excluded. I want you for just a moment to consider a time in your own life, and we won't spend, again, a lot of time here either. This is a great activity for you to utilize in your classes or with your peers, but everybody has had this moment. For me, I will share with you that as a high school student, Again, first gen, low income in a very small town. I recall walking into my high school counselor's office as she was on the phone with a potential scholarship donor. I had applied for a scholarship. And they were discussing all of the applicants, and I walked in and she's on speakerphone, and I walk in quietly so she doesn't know I'm there. And they're discussing whether or not I should be accepted or selected for this particular scholarship opportunity. And she says to them, I don't think that he will be successful in college, right? I think, I know he's done well in high school, but I just don't know, right? No one in his family has gone to college. Nobody's ever really done that before. And I'm just not sure. I think there are a few other students who have more potential than he does that you should consider for this particular opportunity. That was a very defining moment for me, right, in my own life, and really fueled the catalyst for me as I continue my own academic journey. And I always remember her as she said that. I ran into her many years later, had a really interesting dialogue. But I want you, just for one moment, think about a time when you personally felt excluded as you've navigated your own journey, right? And then I will have some questions on this next slide that I want you to consider briefly as well. You can engage in the chat. You can do this exercise, solo to yourself as well. But I want you to think about, in what way were you excluded in that moment, right? How would you describe how you felt, using adjectives as well? Why do you think you were actually excluded in that particular moment, right? And did you express to anyone that you felt excluded? I'm curious to know, did anyone support you in the moment? I'm also very interested in knowing, what did the exclusion prevent, right? As I think about my own journey, I didn't get that scholarship opportunity, but that's okay, because what it promoted for me, which is the next question, is this really kind of go-getter attitude that I was going to be successful no matter what, that I was gonna, push on this journey through life and defy the odds, and not necessarily prove her wrong, but to prove myself right, more than anything else. And then I want you to consider also, how does this impact you to this day, right? And so for just a moment, I'm going to ask that you engage in the chat function and just share with one another, about your particular moment of exclusion, because what that hopefully resonates for people, what I hope happens from that is you understand that there's not a single person on this call, there's not a single person walking this earth who has not had at least one moment where you felt excluded. But there are many of us who walk through life each and every day, and we have more moments of exclusion perhaps than the average, right? Some of us have faced some really unique challenges to be where we are in this particular space. And so if you would, amongst yourselves, please share in the chat your own moments, or use the adjectives that described how you felt. Hopefully there are a few brave people who might want to share in that space. As we continue on, right, I really want this to serve as the catalyst and the foundation of the rest of our conversation this evening. This is why the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is so important. This is why I've devoted 15 years of my career to this space, because it absolutely matters. And we're going to dig a bit deeper into this, right? There's this entire concept of intent versus impact, right? When I eventually had a conversation with my high school counselor, she said to me, well, I just want to be clear that I didn't intend any harm, right? I just wanted them to have the best applicant for this particular scholarship opportunity, right? And so very problematic on lots of levels, but while your intention may be one thing, the impact of that has been felt, right? And we're talking about it here, 20 or so years later, right? And so just always keep in mind your intentions and that impact sometimes are misaligned, but it's important to just stand in the moment to own that, right? And we must commit consistently to making sure that we never make others feel excluded as they navigate through life, right? There are some very broad definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion that I think are really important, right? Sometimes when we talk about diversity, there is a impression that we're only talking about race and ethnicity, right? And I want to be very clear, we use the broadest definition of diversity, right? And that is the richness of human differences across an entire spectrum, right? So it is race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation and gender identity and creed and color and language, but it's religion and spirituality, it's diversity of age and physical characteristics, ability and disability. It's the entire spectrum, right? And so it's really important that as you all continue your own journeys in whatever that space may be professionally, that you operate using the most broad definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion possible. As we talk about equity, truly, this is essentially the condition that's achieved when any identities that I walk to the table with, so first gen, low income, African-American male, all of those identities I possess, if those identities are not impacting how I fare in life, if I have equal access and opportunity as the next person, then we've achieved equity, right? Simply stated. And then inclusion, of course, is just the ongoing and intentional engagement with diversity, equity, and inclusion holistically, right? So here are very simple definitions that I want you to hopefully carry forward from this evening. I know this slide can be a bit much, and so diversity is essentially the presence of differences within a given setting, right? And so keep that in mind as you navigate. We're using this broad definition as we frame this conversation this evening. Equity, of course, is the practice of ensuring that your processes and programs are impartial, fair, and provide equal possible outcomes for every individual. And then inclusion, of course, is the practice of ensuring that people feel a sense of belonging. In this context, we're going to frame it as in the workplace. Okay. So this evening, you did not know that you were going to a party, but you're at a party. And so join me in this party. I want you to, for a moment, and I see that the chat, we only have a couple of comments and I can't even see what those are, but I'm going to ask that you all join with me, particularly on this activity. And I want you to, for just a moment, I want you to imagine that I've given you an unlimited budget to plan your very own party. You can do anything that you want. So I want you to think about where you want this party to be hosted. I want you to think about the people that you want to be at the party. I want you to think about the food. I want you to think about every element of planning your very own party, right? And I want you in the chat to engage for just a moment with me. And I want you to share elements of your perfect party. Where would your party be hosted at? Who would be there, right? What type of music, what type of food? Like, give me everything that you have for your special party. And I want you to, again, utilize this particular activity in a separate space later, because this is an interesting deep dive that you can do. Here's the bottom line, right? As I planned my own party for the very first time, as I went through this activity, what I realized is, my party had everyone there who looked just like me, right? Very similar identities to my own at my party. And there were not a lot of people who were different than me there, right? It was a lot of friends, it was a lot of family, lots of people. And I did this activity for the first time probably about 10 years ago. But it was a really eye-opening experience where I realized, right, as we all should realize, that we keep people closest to us who are very similar to us, who share our identities, right, who think like us, who engage in the same ways that we engage. And my party wasn't incredibly diverse, right? And so I began to think about these questions on this next slide, right? And these are the questions that I have for you all this evening. Who's at your party? Right? Who was not invited to the party that you think may have actually wanted to come to your party, right? Undoubtedly, there are a few people that came to mind for me immediately, right? Who would you invite to the party who wouldn't actually come or want to show up at your party, right? And then I think it's important to also think about why perhaps that individual or those individuals may not want to come to your event, right? What are the reasons? Think about that for a moment. And then what is it about your party that would be welcoming to folks of different backgrounds and identities, right? Is your music inclusive? Is your food choice inclusive, right? All of the things, all of the elements of developing and planning your perfect party. I want you to really think through that. Again, we don't have a ton of time this evening to really do this and unmute in a way that I would like to, but I want you to use this activity later, because this is a very eye-opening experience, right? But what I learned is that I had some work to do as it related to planning my party and inviting people into that space, right? And that, for me, again, underscores and frames the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? We need to diversify. We need to build additional relationships. We need to be open. We need to build our personal board of directors in a way that people can come into that space and join us each and every day, right? And so this brings me to inclusive excellence, right? And this is a concept that I don't know if you all are familiar with. Everybody's heard of diversity, equity, inclusion, but inclusive excellence in my mind is essentially mastery of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the recognition that an organization's success is dependent upon and tied directly to how well it values, engages, and includes the rich diversity of its community members. So this is the goal, right? Diversity can exist, that's a fact, right? But diversity within itself does not lend itself to equity or inclusion, right? Those are intentional practices that you have to get to. We're going to talk about the strategies to get there, but your end goal, what you're really trying to achieve, is inclusive excellence, right? And so I want you all to just remember that concept. So why does any of this even matter? Very quickly, there are two kind of schools of thought around diversity, equity, and inclusion. The first one is the moral imperative, which is it's the right thing to do. It fosters a sense of belonging, right? It allows people to show up and bring their fullest selves into a space, and we should just be doing that, right? I lend myself towards the moral imperative associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I understand as a DEI practitioner that there are some people who don't connect to the moral imperative associated with this work, right? And that's just a fact that you all have to understand as well as you continue your journeys academically and professionally. There are people who don't subscribe to this, right? And so what you also should understand is the business case associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. This is a concept that we talk a lot about in higher education, that we talk about in corporate spaces as well. But this is not just a nice to have, right? This is a business imperative, right? The world is changing before our eyes, right? You all live in a very diverse part of the country. And this is a conversation that still needs to happen there just as much as it happens in the South. The world is changing, right? And we have to keep up with that. And if you all are to remain as a relevant option for higher education, if your workplaces are to remain as a relevant option for employment, you have to get this right. Right? And we know that it enhances recruitment, it supports retention, it drives innovation. We know that teams that are more diverse in nature are more successful, right? Those teams are more creative, they produce better work. Why is that, right? Because if you bring a bunch of people to the table who all think just alike, behave just alike, you're going to continue to get the same results, right? Everybody on this call fundamentally understands that. But it also helps organizations really put actions behind words. Everybody has a chief diversity officer now. Everybody has beautiful statements on their websites, right? But what does that really mean? And how do we dig deeper to actually drive real strategic work in this space, right? So there's the moral imperative, which is very important, but there's also the business case, and it's critical that you understand in this space as well. So now we will get into kind of the meat and potatoes of this conversation this afternoon. And we're going to talk about how you build your specific toolkit. I will preface this by saying this is not rocket science, right? But I hope that it's life-changing for somebody on this call and that you walk away feeling like you have a better understanding of how to engage in this work, right? The first step is very simple. You collaborate, right? You don't achieve greatness and success as if you operate as a single island, right? And so in every opportunity that you have as you navigate your academic journeys and in your personal lives, you need to explore and engage with the diversity of perspectives, right? Bring people to the table who think differently than you, right? It's easy to stray away from those individuals, but it's so important that you do that consistently. And we'll talk about how to do that as well. It's important to understand, right? You're not going to know everything right away. We talk about cultural competence historically, and now we talk about cultural consciousness. Cultural competence was this concept that you could go to some trainings and you could understand generally enough about people, right? And you can understand difference in the most fundamental, foundational sense. Cultural consciousness, which is now this recognition and understanding that you must have an ongoing and intentional kind of commitment to engage in DEI. You can't go to one training and get it all. You won't leave here tonight as an expert. This is a very high level kind of overview of this work. And that's really important that I say that to you tonight as well. You're not leaving here tonight as an expert. You don't leave here tonight not needing to engage in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion anymore, right? Ongoing, intentional. It's really important that in a part of your understanding, you assess your own privilege and bias. We have made privilege a dirty word, and it's really important that we unpack this for just a moment, right? And I want to share with you all that everyone has privilege, right? And a lot of people don't realize that. We have put a lot of words in front of privilege, and it's really important to understand those concepts. So when we talk about male privilege or white privilege or whatever that privilege is, those are real. And it's important that we stand in that we understand those concepts. But everyone has privilege, right? I have privilege as a male. I have privilege as someone who is navigated as an executive. I have privilege as someone who is fairly upper middle class at this point in my life as well, right? There's lots of types of privilege that come from your experiences as you navigate life. And it's really important that you understand that you own that, and that you understand that it's not a dirty word, right? It's also important that you understand bias. Everybody has bias as well. Some unconscious or implicit, things that we don't really realize that we're doing sometimes. Sometimes that bias is blatant. We know exactly what we're doing, right? And everybody has both of those buckets, and it's important that you understand that as well. It's important that you learn, right? It's not people of color, people of marginalized backgrounds' responsibility to educate you on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's important that you take the time to learn about the use of things like inclusive language, why that's important, why we use that, why I have pronouns next to my name this evening as I present to you, right? And people would say, well, Dr. Wilson, we wouldn't mistake you. The reality is it's not so much for me as it is about normalizing it for others, right? That's what this is about. And so I choose to use my pronouns in every space virtually. I choose to use it on name tags. I choose to use it on business cards to normalize that for folks who need that, right? And just as much, I feel like I need it at this point because it's important to me, right? To be a diversity champion, right? I'll get off of that little soapbox and we'll continue here. I have lots of slides to get through in a very short amount of time. Communication is the key, right? You have to customize your communication style to ensure that your colleagues are served and reached at all times. I can't stress to you enough the importance of being authentic and transparent. There's so many concerns right now about cancel culture. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. Nobody will deal with me anymore. Nobody will talk to me anymore. It's important. I don't subscribe to cancel culture, by the way. I think that everybody operates in a space where they deserve grace, right? There are some non-negotiables at the intersection of things like threats, harassment, and discrimination. That's a whole different bucket. But in general, everybody's going to make a mistake, right? I love to tell the story of how I grew up in rural South Arkansas, right? So as you can imagine, there are some things that I had to unlearn. There are some things that I had to learn. There are some, lots of things about my own experience. And so I approach this work as someone who never professes to be perfect, who never claims to always get it right, but is always claiming to be committed to learning and to growing and to owning my stuff, right? And that's what this is really about. So as you navigate your own journeys, be authentic, be transparent, right? Always cultivate environments for people where they have the opportunity to be extended the same grace that you would want as well. It's important that you reflect and think about how your actions impact others. This is where we talk about intention versus impact again, right? How do you consider people of different identities in your own work? This is an important consideration to make, right? If you are serving a diverse population, right? And I'll frame it very quickly from the standpoint of executive recruitment. The reason I went into this work, again, is because I wanted to diversify this experience. I've been placed by multiple executive recruitment firms in my own journey. And there are some gaps, right? In how we navigate candidates of color, right, as they navigate their process. And so I really wanted to jump into this space and use a DEI lens as we work with candidates and as we develop them, right? That's what this is about. So how do you examine people of color and people of different identities in your own work as you navigate as well? Examine and develop your own personal board of directors, right? As we talked about the party activity and how we tend to gravitate towards people who are very similar to ourselves, it's important that you have a group of people that you surround yourself with who can speak life into you, who have permission to correct you, who have permission to, say things to you that perhaps you wouldn't want anyone else to say to you, right? I have my own personal board of directors that is incredibly diverse, right? People from all walks of life that help me, push me, and I grow as a result of my engagement with those individuals, right? Reach out, expand your network, and seek out opportunities to engage with people outside of your normal social circles, and then include, as you plan events and meetings and services, whatever it is that your world allows you to navigate, you need to make sure that those meetings, those events are inclusive and that you're considering different stages of life, cultures, all of the things, right? That's super important. Promote and champion. Support employees, colleagues, and friends of different backgrounds in their efforts, right? One of the things that I take a lot of pride in is mentoring others in the field, particularly younger professionals, professionals of color, professionals who have other marginalized identities. I want to bring those people along on a journey with me, right? I have not been as fortunate as I've been in my own career and in my own journey to operate again in a silo, right? My responsibility is to reach back and to bring other people along and to support them on their own journey. So how are you doing that from your own lens and from your own purview, right? You need to bring people into the spaces that you have been so fortunate to have access to. Really important, right? respect, right? Create brave spaces, right? Notice I didn't say safe spaces, but brave spaces for all people to share their identities and their unique experiences. This is where active listening comes in. This is where I also would talk about oppression Olympics and say, all right, sometimes it's easy to fall into this. Well, I had it worse than you because here was my experience and here are all the things, right? And there are varying degrees, right, of experiences. And it's important to understand that. But don't fall into the game of oppression Olympics that keeps us stuck and we never move if that's what we do consistently, right? It's important also that you amplify, right? Engage consistently, step aside so that others can step forward. Is Dr. Wilson saying to you that you should like go quit your job so that a person of color or someone else can have it? That is not what he's saying to you, right? I want to be very clear about that. What I'm saying is you bring others along on that journey with you, going back to the promotion and the champion piece that we just spoke about. It's just underscore of that. It's so important that you leverage and utilize the privilege that you have to support others on their own journeys as they navigate, right? And then it's important to continue these conversations in the work, even when you don't achieve instant gratification. DEI work is hard, right? It's very subjective. It takes a long time to move the needle as it relates to things like recruitment, retention, and advancement of your workforce, of those you serve. So you're never going to get quite instant gratification as you navigate on this journey. But that is the key, is to keep on going, be really intentional, build real strategies, embed this into your organizational structure in a way that it's meaningful and intentional, so that real work happens, right? Again, not one training, not one speaker, not just this one-off situation, right? So here's some best practices that I want to share with you. And we'll do these very quickly as well, because I want to be respectful of our students, our leaders who are going to engage us in continued conversation this evening, right? So here's some things that you can do. Again, these are across the entire spectrum. I could teach a whole lesson on any one of these bullets. And so if you want more information, I'm going to share my email address and my cell phone number at the end of this presentation. And I would love to continue the conversation, recognizing that we don't have a lot of time, right? One thing that you can do is eliminate traditional educational prerequisites from job descriptions. This is something that I champion in the higher education context, specifically because we don't tend to pay very well for positions that sometimes we will say, you need a master's degree to be an academic advisor at this institution, but we're only going to pay you $35,000 a year to do that, right? There's a misalignment as we think about that. And as we think about equity, it's really important that you use your privilege, your power to think about how do you make sure that what we're requesting from an educational perspective is equitable and fair, right? Look for talent using diverse platforms. If you recruit and go after people in the same way that you've always gone after them, and that's not yielding results of diverse candidate pools or diverse talent, it's time to diversify that experience as well. Support remote work. Why would he mention remote work on a presentation about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because this is important as well, right? As we think about women in particular, dads, single parents who have to balance all of these different responsibilities in life. Remote work has become increasingly important, right? This is super important, and I can't stress it enough. I'm in a position where I work fully remote. I can live anywhere in the country and do my job. I still live just outside of Savannah, Georgia, at this point, but I can live anywhere, be anywhere, right? And as you think about how you support your employees, support retention, driving advancement, more productivity, remote work supports that, right? Offering parental leave and flexible working arrangements goes right back to what we were just discussing as well. This becomes really important because you do have people who have varying degrees of responsibilities. And then just because they're not sitting in an office at 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 doesn't mean that they can't be productive in their work, right? Conducting regular salary reviews is absolutely critical. Something else that I'm very passionate about is salary equity. Undoubtedly, in most cases, it seems that women and people of color often have much lower salaries than their counterparts in a particular workspace. So when you have the opportunity as a leader within an organization to examine salary, as I have, it's really important that you utilize that opportunity as well, and to make sure that that's not an issue of equity for you in that space, right? Holding the leadership team accountable for inclusivity goals every year or every quarter. This is important. As we think about the development of like a high-level diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan that supports the overarching mission of a particular organization, this work is only as good as what you measure. Right. And so what we value, we measure in every organization that I've ever been a part of. And so it's absolutely critical that as you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you frame real goals that are measurable and attainable and achievable. And you're holding everyone within the organization accountable for that. Right. Thinking about how you actually evaluate employees. I think that there should always be measures in employee evaluations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just a firm believer in that, right? I talk about bringing in guest speakers and experts, right, on a regular and ongoing basis to share their experiences from a learning perspective. You want to implement best practices for search committees, right? So as you think about how you recruit employees, think about the interview process. Think about some of the really inappropriate questions that you may have heard asked during a recruitment process for a particular candidate. It's really important to provide training on implicit or unconscious bias at the beginning of a search process as you recruit employees, and then to hold that committee accountable for how you engage, how you recruit, and hopefully how you go on to retain those employees later, right? Promoting mental health literacy, very important as well, right? This is something that we don't talk a whole lot about at the intersection of DEI. In this presentation, I apologize. It's like spitting fire right now, but it's so many elements of DEI. And I want to make sure that you leave here understanding he didn't just come in and talk about race and ethnicity. He framed it broadly for us because I really want you to understand all of these things support and impact the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mental health, as you all know, really significant issue. We saw it a lot in university campuses. We see it a lot in professional workplaces. It's a big deal right now. And it's really important that we teach and educate folks on how to understand some of the challenges that their colleagues, their students, whoever, right, clients may be up against, right? And that we don't treat those people a particular way because of whatever challenges they may have had, and that we fully understand and promote mental health, wellness, and literacy as well. We talked about bullet one here, committing to regular policy review to ensure that DEI is central in everything that you do. Every company has undoubtedly this huge book of policies, right? Employee handbooks, policies around recruitment and retention and all of the things. How important and how central is diversity, equity, and inclusion in those policies, right? There's an opportunity to always consider diversity, equity, and inclusion in any policy that you develop for an institution. One of the things that we've done, just in the short amount of time that I've been in executive recruitment, we actually do credit checks, or we did do credit checks on every applicant who progressed to a finalist in a search for us, right? Why were we doing that? Was that necessary? Did that really make sense to do credit checks on every individual? Or did they have some type of responsibility of major budgets as they navigated? Was that a requirement from the institution? Were they asking us to do that, right? And so we've been able to really examine that as a firm, and we now have removed our requirement to do credit checks. And we were supplying credit information to institutions. And in some cases, they didn't even want that information, right? And we were making judgment and value calls on the quality of an applicant based on that. That's one example of how you can examine policies to make sure that they make sense, right? And that we're not putting some type of unnecessary burden on folks as they navigate processes with us. We want to devote resources to create a positive environment that allows every member of a team to experience a sense of belonging, right? That means that diversity work is not always going to be free. Sometimes we need real resources devoted to this in order to move the needle with respect to work, right? Creating a culture in which the use of pronouns and introductions, email signatures, Zoom meetings, right, is a consistent process because that's so important, right? Have discussions on setting boundaries around work and non-work spaces and model boundary setting for your employees, right? So I don't want to receive emails from my boss at 3 a.m. with the expectation that I'm responding at 8 a.m., right? Creating boundaries, that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. Building diversity, equity, and inclusion language into your position descriptions, absolutely critical for sure. And incorporating DEI, as I mentioned, into performance evaluation, right? I'm going to run through these very quickly. Bear with me, okay? So being aware of how racism and discrimination are unique stressors to employees is critical as well. Not denying that these things exist, not denying that these are real issues, absolutely absolutely critical, right? As it relates to, do we show up and bring our full selves into the workplace, or are there parts of our identities that we feel like we have to check at the door in order to be accepted in mainstream professional settings, right? Supporting and encouraging your employees to join employee resource groups. These are really critical and important spaces for individuals to be in community with one another. Taking steps to avoid cultural taxation. I don't want to be on every committee related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I don't want to serve on every committee because you need a Black person to be on that committee, right? Thinking about that. And if you are using and tapping the same people over and over again to be on committees and to serve in certain spaces because it is convenient for you, and you're not considering the impact to those individuals, we have a problem as well, right? Encouraging your employees to take time to rest and heal, considering how workloads will be managed while coworkers are away. There's nothing worse than taking vacation and then you come back and you may come back to 300 emails. And so how do we support our employees to make sure that as they transition to go enjoy their well-deserved vacation, that we're balancing workloads in a way that are meaningful and intentional as well, right? Recognizing that every employee is different. If you see me as a Black man, the next Black man that you see may have very different experiences than mine, right? So don't put us all in a box and assume that we're all the same, right? Acknowledging grief in its many forms, particularly as we've navigated COVID-19 and all of the things, right? Grief is real. And so we need to slow down and we need to recognize that as well. And then simply, this isn't rocket science either, but ask your employees what they think about their experience and then listen to them. All right. So often we will do surveys and ask a million questions about what do you think about this? We collect all of this data and then we do nothing with the data, right? And so I will leave you with this. What would happen if we all just took one step towards inclusive excellence, right? It's my belief that we would move from unconscious bias to what I call conscious inclusion. That's the goal, right? You want to be inclusive and you want to do so because it's important and it means something to you as an individual. And so additionally, I would normally kind of stop sharing here and I will in a moment, but I'm curious to know what practical steps could you take to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and will you take to promote diversity, equity, inclusion in the spaces that you actually inhabit, right? Recognizing that it's so much more than what most people consider walking into a conversation, and that all of these things absolutely matter. I want you all to be or continue to be incredible students, professionals, faculty members, staff members, whoever you are on this call, right? And I want you to always be mindful and intentional about all of the things. So I'll leave you with a quick call to action. And then I promise I'm going to shut up because I know I've gone over my time, right? I want you to be brave enough, right, to admit and reflect on your biases and your missteps. I want you to be strong enough to acknowledge that you may not fully understand and appreciate the challenges of others, right? But there are ways to help and you can learn and you can grow in that space. I want you to be humble enough to recognize that you will never be done learning. I'll never be done learning, even as somebody who considers themselves to be a diversity expert. I want you to set an example on how to approach uncomfortable topics and situations with compassion, right? We're going to get away from cancel culture and we're going to demonstrate love, grace, and compassion to one another. I want you to not let the fear of getting it wrong keep you from trying, right? You're gonna make missteps, right? Again, there are some deal breakers: threats, harassment, and discrimination. In the absence of threats, harassment, and discrimination, extend grace to people, right? Help them to grow and to learn and to develop in this space. And then I want you to be thoughtful and intentional and take care of your colleagues, of your clients, of your fellow classmates, of all the people that you have the opportunity to impact. I also want this to carry over into your personal lives, right? I don't want this to be a mask that you put on to walk into the workplace because you feel like it's the right thing to do. I hope that this permeates your entire existence and you move forward thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion intentionally. I totally apologize for going over on time, but it's just my way. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I welcome any questions that you all may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. That was definitely very informative. As someone who's been a DEI advocate for some time, definitely some takeaways that I have there. We're going to start with the Q&A. So our first question comes from Alexis. Alexis asks, what are some best practices for recruiting with a DEI focus when the organization you work with is supportive, but they're also predominantly white?
Sure, absolutely. From a recruitment perspective, I think there are lots of things that can be done, right? I think it starts with building out the position descriptions. One of the reasons why a lot of times you may be attracting the people who are, very homogenous is because the language in your position descriptions doesn't support diversity, right? If I read your position description, do I read it and feel like I could see myself in your workplace? If I go to your website, if I look at your marketing, do I see myself reflected in that space, right? So I think one of the first things you can do is think about position descriptions as they're built, but I think you can also think more intentionally about the culture and the climate of your organization, right? Before you go out and start recruiting a bunch of people of color or people of other marginalized identities and backgrounds, ask yourself, what is it about our organization that would attract them? And not just attract them, but retain them in that space as well, right? I think that has to be your first consideration. I think you can advertise position descriptions if you get all of that other stuff right in diverse spaces so that you can attract those individuals. But I think more so for me, right, as I think about the recruitment piece, how do you treat people during the recruitment process, right? Are you treating them well? Are you answering their questions? Again, do you have an environment that supports their growth? If I come to a job interview and I'm sitting around a table and nobody looks like me, nobody shares my identities, I may believe that I don't have a voice in that particular space. And so I think, particularly for organizations that are very homogenous, I think the first question becomes, what is our commitment? Like, why do we desire to diversify the space, right? And hopefully there's a commitment there to do this with some level of intentionality. If there's not a commitment to do it, I think those become the first conversations, right? Because there's nothing worse than recruiting someone into a workspace and then they get there and literally they're not supported, right? Or they're leaving your organization within the first 6 months or first year or whatever the case may be, because you got them there, but you didn't support them, right? And so many things that need to be considered. Again, I could talk for hours on just that one thing, but I'm going to shut up so we can get through more questions.
Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
So our second question comes from Vogue, and it is, how did you navigate resistance, if any, to diversify the organizations that you work for?
Yeah, can you repeat that for me? I'm sorry.
How did you navigate resistance, if there was any, to
Gotcha.
diversify the organizations that you worked for?
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I have done diversity work at a lot of really interesting places. I'm a Southerner. I grew up in South Arkansas. And so most recently, I served as Chief Diversity Officer at an institution here in Georgia. 27,000 students, about 3,300 employees, Georgia Southern University. You can hear it even in the name of the organization. And so as you can imagine, I was met with incredible resistance. I received in my first few months on the job at Georgia death threats sent to my email. Folks telling me that, I shouldn't be there. I was the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer for the institution as well. And I came in with a very strong reputation from my previous institution around how I do this work and how I engage. And I came in and developed inclusive excellence strategic plan for the university within the first 6 months on the job and rolled it out, right? And it called for sweeping changes to the organization. And so I was met with resistance from even our faculty senate as I started talking about how we diversify our faculty and my expectations and hopes around what I would like to be their own commitment and what I wanted them to own as it related to faculty recruitment, retention, and advancement, as I asked them to start considering work around diversity, equity, and inclusion in tenure and promotion materials for the university as well. I really wanted them to think more strategically about what that looked like and how we recruited and retained folks at the university. As you can imagine, not everybody likes that, right? Because not everybody subscribes to that moral imperative that we talked about. Some people, I really had to lean into the business case for this work for them. And so I will tell you that one of the things that has really served me well is the business case for diversity, really being able to articulate what that is for a particular organization, right? And so I started saying to them, if you still want, students of color to come to this institution, and if you want them to have a good experience when they're here, 30% of our students at Georgia Southern University are African American. but only about 6% of our faculty was African American, right? And so I began to just really demonstrate for them. I utilized students a lot to engage in conversations and panel discussions around their hopes for the institution as well, so that faculty could sit back and listen for a bit. Because it's one thing for me as a professional to, say, oh, this is what you should be doing. But when you listen to our students, the people that we're all here to serve, the reason that we're here and the reason we exist, you can't listen to those individuals and not have compassion and want to move the needle forward. And if you can listen to that and not desire to do better, then it's my belief that you're just in the wrong profession altogether, right? And so there's always going to be resistance. That's a reality, but you have to keep pushing forward, right? And you have to have real strategy, you have to be strong. You also have to be able to articulate what the real expectations are and what those measurable outcomes are as well. So yeah.
Thank you again for that answer. Okay, so our next question is, people love to say, I don't see color or I'm not racist. How can we begin to get members of a team to realize that we all have implicit biases that impact how and what we do?
Yeah. So the whole I don't see color thing is always, it goes back to intent versus impact, right? So the intention is to make you feel like they are super inclusive and all the things, but what it does in reality, and so many people don't realize this, and so it's important to explain it to people in real time. What it does is says that my identities that I have are not important to you. That's what I hear when somebody says, I don't see color, right? It's not so much that I think, oh, you're this amazing person now, right? You really don't see it. So I slow down and I explain to people, right? I know you didn't mean this, but what I just heard, right? What I took from that is the identities that I possess are not important to you, right? That's going to be something that most people, when they hear you articulate that, right? They immediately kind of say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize, right? And so again, it goes back to extending grace, not that it's your responsibility to educate and to teach people every time something crops up, right? I want to be clear about that. But there are these moments, right, that could be light bulb moments for individuals. And if you have a good relationship with them, and if you're close to them, you can absolutely, speak up in that moment. I always tell people it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? And so in that moment, if I respect you, if you're somebody who I think is solid, I'm going to slow down and I'm going to explain to you why what you said was actually problematic. Okay. I got stuck at the beginning of your question. What was the rest of it? I'm so sorry.
So it was basically just what are some strategies for introducing that topic to
Gotcha.
these companies or these team members that may be feeling that way or may have that
Sure.
thought?
Absolutely. The other thing more broadly around implicit or unconscious bias is that we have weaponized it in many cases, and people believe that only certain people have it, right? I have been in spaces where I've had, in particular, members of the majority say to me, well, you're the first person who's explained it in a way that you discuss that everybody has unconscious or implicit bias, right? Or that everybody has privilege, right? And so in many ways, it's been weaponized and used as like, oh, you have this, but I don't, and somehow I'm perfect, right? And so it's really important to take a step back and to frame it broadly, right? If you want to bring people along on a journey, if you want them to feel like they're a part of this work, you really have to just lay it out plainly, right? And if you walk into a space and say, you have privilege and you have this and you have that, and somehow you act like you don't, right? I think you framed the entire conversation and you've set it up for failure, quite honestly, right? And so I think one major strategy is to frame it in a way that people can connect to it and to understand, right? And it's not to be weaponized. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have time for one more question. So you mentioned before about mental health literacy. And one thing that I know is that as a DEI professional, it must get tiring.
Yeah.
So how do you maintain hope when it seems that there isn't any? And also, what are your self-care tips?
Yeah. So I will say I have not always been great at this, right? I'm very much a workaholic and always have been. And this is work that I always tell people, you don't get to leave this work at 5 o'clock and walk out of your office. This work stays on you. Your identities are wrapped up in it. There's no other position on a senior leadership team, in my opinion, at an institution where your identity is in question and wrapped up in the work that you do each and every day. I just firmly believe that, right? So for me, what I have learned to do is to always take care of myself, right? And to know when I've given my all to an institution or to an organization, and when it's time for me to move on and to protect myself and my peace, right? I'm a lover of travel. I'm a lover of my family. I'm a lover of taking care of myself, right? And so I'm always going to prioritize myself as I navigate, because the work is heavy, right? It's so easy to get bogged down in this. And I've been guilty of that for a really long time. One of the reasons why I now do executive recruitment is because for 15 years, I poured in everything to DEI, right? And DEI didn't always love me back as I navigated that journey. And so rather than continue and completely burn out in the field, I said to myself, you need to go do diversity work in a different way for a bit, right? You need to go impact. You can still do diversity work, but it doesn't need to be the badge that you carry each and every day, right? And at some point in time, you'll build yourself back up and you can return to this work and you can do it full throttle, right? And so my departure as a chief diversity officer is not indicative that I don't care anymore or that I won't be back. But that is my own self-care in this season of my life, was to take a step back to protect myself. And I'll get back to that full time if that's, ultimately where I feel like I belong. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. That was super helpful for us. I know for myself, especially. So before I turn this back over to Suzette to wrap this up, just want to do a shameless plug really quickly. We are the LEAD Club, which stands for Leading Ethically with Accountability and Diversity. We are open and accepting all students, grad, undergrad, whoever is interested in learning more about what we do and who we are. We do have a general member meeting coming up in April. I'm going to drop the link right in the chat right now. Anyone who wants to learn more or want to connect about what we do, you can definitely reach out to us at that link. Send us a message, send us an email, and we'll be glad to invite you to our next general member meeting. Suzette, turning it right over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. And I am happy you mentioned the LEAD Club. Folks, even before we started, David said to me, if you didn't do it, I would do it. David said to me, make sure to give them a shout out, because this club is doing really good work on campus. I have to say, it's so wonderful to see all the MSL students on here. We've been direct messaging. We're multitasking, Tajuan, but we've been direct messaging during this, and some of the messages were how wonderful and relevant your conversation was. And I know you covered a lot of ground, and we recorded this, so we are gonna, we'll share the recording with the faculty and staff. We are pretty, talk about privilege. We are pretty blessed. I've been at Lehman for a long time, and there is work to be done, but the faculty and staff on this call are really diligent about it.